Hello everyone! Welcome to mindbraintalks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here I discuss and describe a lot of topics, themes and research findings regarding psychology and neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to know more about it. All videos here are just for educational purposes and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. Today's theme is related to the question, what is neuropsychology? What is its fundamentals? What is its research subject? I will try to answer this question with this video, so please stay tuned if you want to know more about what is neuropsychology. Now let's look to the manuals that I use to develop today's video. So the first is the principles of neuropsychology, the second, fundamentals of human neuropsychology, the third is the Neuropsychology Handbook. The fourth is the Handbook of Clinical Neuropsychology. The fifth is the Neuropsychological Assessment from Lesac, which is a very good manual. And the sixth, it was the Clinical Neuropsychology from Laura Gonstein and Jane McNeil. So I think these books are very important to study and are very important if you want to know more about neuropsychology. So now let's see what is neuropsychology. Neuropsychology can be defined as a branch of psychology and/or neuroscience, and neuropsychology is a branch that studies the brain and the rest of the nervous system and its influences on the person's cognitions and behavior. It's focused on how injuries or illness of the brain affect cognitive functions and behavior. Neuropsychology is not only based on brain impairment and brain lesions, okay? But we will see in the future. So, neuropsychology is also experimental and a clinical field of psychology and is focused to understand how behavior and cognition are influenced by brain functioning. Okay? Neuropsychology is focused on how the brain function may influence the behavior and the cognition. So, neuropsychologists work in research settings such as universities, laboratories, clinical settings such as medical hospitals or rehabilitation settings, and in forensic settings or another kind of industry. However, neuropsychologists may also work in schools. There are a new branch of neuropsychology, which is school neuropsychology, which is focused more on the neurocognitive processes that are underlying the processes of learning. So it's also a very important scientific field in the study of the neurocognitive processes that are important to the understanding and learning within a school setting. So, what is important to retain from this video is that neuropsychology is a scientific study of the relationships between brain, behavior and the mind. As you will see in the future, clinical neuropsychology is a branch of neuropsychology which is more focused on the assessment and on the intervention of neurocognitive processes that may be impaired due to traumatic brain injury or brain lesions. But you will see in the future how it unfolds through time. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video's description regarding today's theme, to see the manuals and the books that I am recommending to you. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Also, you can use the comment section below to say something about this video, so please express your mind and express your thoughts. Let me know what you think about all of this. Welcome to mindbraintalks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to mindbraintalks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here I discuss and describe a lot of topics related to psychology and neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to know more about these subjects. All contents here are just for educational purposes and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. Today's topic is a topic that is very important to me. The topic is about clinical neuropsychology. As you know, I am a clinical neuropsychologist and then I am very interested in these topics. What is clinical neuropsychology? What it is? How professionals with a degree in clinical neuropsychology work? What they do? These are some questions that I'll try to show to you here, and I hope you understand and I hope you learn a little bit more about this subfield, sometimes from psychology, sometimes from neurology or neurosciences. So stay tuned and let's go! These are the manuals that I recommend to you if you want to explore clinical neuropsychology. These are the manuals that I think that are very important to understand and to study more about this subject. So now let's see what is clinical neuropsychology. Clinical neuropsychology is the application of a neuropsychological knowledge to the assessment, management and rehabilitation of people who suffered illness or injury, typically injuries based on the brain injury, which has caused some neurocognitive deficits, such as deficits in executive functions, attention, memory, which have expression in behavioral dysfunctions. So people tend to have more difficulties in everyday life situations. So, clinical neuropsychology is focused on the assessment and rehabilitation of acquired brain injury, such as stroke, aneurysm, traumatic brain injury, neuropsychological syndromes, such as dissociative syndromes, agnosia, aphasia, alexia, and so on, learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, neurodevelopmental disorders, such as ADHD, Tourette's, and neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer, Parkinson, frontotemporal dementia, and so forth. Also, clinical neuropsychology is also focused on the assessment of neuropsychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar, and so forth. Clinical neuropsychology is primarily focused on the assessment and rehabilitation of alterations in the brain functioning. And the brain functioning is very important in different kinds of processes. These processes may be viewed as neurocognitive processes. These processes are a result from the integrated brain functioning. So, the neurocognitive functions or domains that are typically assessed by neuropsychologists are executive functions, which have comprised these functions such as inhibition, adapting, shifting, planning, and decision making. Another domain is complex attention, and within this domain we can find arousal, sustained, selective, alternate and divided attention. So that's why it's called a complex attention, because attention is not one process but different kinds of different sub-processes. Also, reasoning, when we can find deductive, inductive, abstract or concrete thinking. Memory, of course, clinical neuropsychologists are very focused on memory. It's a hot topic in neuropsychology. Within memory, we can find working memory, declarative, semantic, recall and cued memory, which are two different processes. Language. Language is also very important for everyday life, and that's why a clinical neuropsychologist is very focused on language. Within this domain we can find fluency, expressive speaking, understanding and writing. Perceptual organization is also a hot topic in a clinical neuropsychologist because it has lots of impacts in everyday life. Imagine if you can't describe and differentiate the distance between your hand and other objects. This is some kind of deficit sometimes individuals who suffered from traumatic brain injury or strokes may have if some kind of cortical connection that is responsible for perceptual organization is impaired. So, psychomotor functions such as praxis and gnosis, access to knowledge, social cognition and personality, intelligence and self-reflection skills, and of course dysfunctional behavior and symptomatology typically driven by impaired brain functions. So, as I said to you, a clinical neuropsychologist is based in the principles of assessment and principles of rehabilitation. It's a fundamental aspect of a clinical neuropsychologist that has lots of tests to assess different brain functions that could be impaired and to use the product of the assessment to develop new ways and new kinds of rehabilitation, which is tended to be focused on individual characteristics and individual difficulties. As you are seeing from the beginning to here, clinical neuropsychology is based on two great aspects. It's the clinical assessment and the clinical rehabilitation. Assessment is based on the identification of neurocognitive deficits, and rehabilitation, it's the principles that guide how clinical neuropsychologists intervene with these kind of subjects. For instance, a person with frontotemporal dementia, how he can rehabilitate the frontal lobe functioning. It's different kinds of exercises to executive functions, selective attention, or inhibition procedures. So, as I said before, the neuropsychology uses standardized neuropsychological tests to assess cognitive and behavioral performance and to link them to specific neurocognitive processes. Of course, these tend to be an individualized neuropsychological assessment which is focused on specific difficulties that specific individuals bring to the session. Of course, and the neuropsychological tests are a product of a standardization process. Some types of clinical neuropsychology methods or instruments may be Visual Memory Scale, Wisconsin Card Sorting Test, the Mental Visual Attention Test, and so forth. Another methods that a clinical neuropsychologist may use to understand how brain and behavior may be related is by using brain scans such as functional magnetic resonance, positron emission tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and computed axial tomography, typically known as CAT. So don't worry if you don't know what these brain scans are. In the future I will produce different videos talking about them. So there are other projects that may help or may be related to clinical neuropsychology, such as Global Brain Project. Another kind of assessment that neuropsychologists use is electrophysiology, such as electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. And another way that clinical neuropsychologists may also explore how brain and behavior relationships may be impaired is using experimental tasks where the outcomes are reaction times and accuracy to explore performance in that tasks. Keep in mind, there are lots of things that were not covered in this video. However, in the future, I will look to these things and I'll try to explain them in the future videos. So stay tuned if you want to know more about clinical neuropsychology. So, So now let's just summarize the contents of today. 1. So, clinical neuropsychology is a branch of psychology and neurology that studies the relationship between brain, cognition and behavior. And clinical neuropsychology is focused on brain injury and neurocognitive processes. We look to neurocognitive functions such as attention, memory, executive functions and others. So, and a clinical neuropsychologist is based on the assessment and rehabilitation of that impaired neurocognitive functions. And we also saw that clinical neuropsychologists may use different methods and different kinds of research to explore the relationships between brain, behavior and cognition. So, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video's description regarding today's theme, to look to the manuals that I recommend to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. And you can also leave a comment to express your thoughts and to express your mind. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. All videos here are just for educational purposes and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. These are the 6 manuals that I used to develop this video. So, let's go see them. So the first is the Principles of Neuropsychology. The second, Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology. The third, it's the Neuropsychology Handbook. The fourth, it's the Handbook of Clinical Neuropsychology. The fifth, it's the Neuropsychological Assessment from Lesac, which is a very good manual. And the sixth, it was the Clinical Neuropsychology from Laura Gonstein and Jane McNeil. As you are seeing, neuropsychology is the scientific field that studies the relationships between brain, behavior and cognition. The notion that the brain is the organ of the mind and the brain is the organ of neurocognitive processes, it's not new to us. However, this idea had been developed through many years. So let's look to the story of neuropsychology and let's look to the story about how the brain starts to get noticed as the center of the mind. So, the notion of neuropsychology, or the notion about the study of the relationships between brain and behavior, can be traced through ancient history, or even earlier. There were too much debate in different societies when we start to considering that the body and the mind could be related to different organs in our brain, in our mind. So for many centuries the brain was thought to be useless and discarded. This notion has been changed through time, through the evolution in anatomy and physiology. So let's take a brief overview on this. Mental functions were viewed from a religious point of view, and human mental dysfunctions were attributed to evil spirits and the gods. I think this is not new information for you. So the brain has not always been considered the center of the functioning body. It took too many centuries to acknowledge that the importance of the brain as the organ of the mind. This is a core feature here. Now we know that the brain is the main organ of the mind. So many functions that our mind have would not be possible if the brain is not there, if the brain is not working, okay? So, even in antiquity, lots of researchers tried to study the brain, and they developed a technique called the trephination, which is defined as the ancient surgical operation that involves cutting, scraping, chiseling and or drilling a plug-like piece of bone from the skull. As you can see here in this picture, the physicians tend to do some kind of hole in the brain and they try to study the brain within a living person. The classical Greeks wrote the first accounts of the brain and behavior relationships. Heraclitus was one of the first philosophers that say that the mind is an enormous space with never-ending boundaries. So he has the notion that the mind is a very, very huge domain which we may never look to his boundaries. However, Pythagoras, a very well-known ancient Greek philosopher, was the first to suggest that the brain could be the center of the human reasoning and may play a role in the soul's life. So this is the fundamentals and the essentials of that later became known as the brain hypothesis, which is the idea that the brain is the source of all behavior. So here, Heraclitus and Pythagoras were the first ones that start to develop the notion that maybe the brain could be the center of the mind and also it could be the center of the soul. This is the fundamentals of the brain hypothesis. So, another ancient Greek, a very well-known ancient Greek, Hippocrates, which is the father of modern medicine, also believed that the brain controls all senses and movements. He studied some patients where paralysis occurred in the side of the body opposite to the side of the head injury. This is very important because it's the first time in history that we start to get notice that the brain could be working on opposite sides of the body. This is very important. So, following the areas governed by the right and left hemispheres of the brain, Hippocrates noticed that one side of the brain could lead to or could govern other areas, contralateral areas of the body. This is very important. So, Hippocrates also stated that pleasure, merriment, laughter, amusement, as well as grief, pain and anxiety could all arise from the brain. This is also a very important notion because we start to notice that not only body movement but also some kind of mental states or states of mind could also arise from the brain and from the brain functioning. However, Plato suggested that the soul may be divided or could be divided in three different parts: appetite, reason and temper. This kind of notion had helped Freud to develop his notions about the mind, which is id or id, ego and superego. So Freud, you know Freud, of course, Freud starts to use the notion of Plato to develop his own theory about conscious and unconscious mind. However, not all ancient philosophers believed that the brain was the center of the body. Not all ancient philosophers believed that the brain was the center of the body and the brain was important to behavior. Aristotle, which is also a very known Greek philosopher, was a creative thinker in various fields. However, he made some mistakes. He believed that the heart could be the source of all mental processes, and he developed which was known as the cardiac hypothesis, where the heart is the seat of every emotions and the heart is the seat of every mental process. Later, in Egypt, Alexandrian school developed some different notions. scientists work hard in new advances in physiology and anatomy, and knowledge of the nervous system and neuroanatomy were stemmed from the performing of public dissections. So these scientists start to perform public dissections about dead people. However, these dissections had boosted the knowledge about the nervous system, which is also very important. So they start to develop which was later known as the ventricular localization hypothesis, which postulates that mental and spiritual processes may reside in the ventricular chambers of the brain. This hypothesis later became known as the cell doctrine, which means that the cell is a small compartment in a ventricle. This theory, this doctrine, take about 2000 years to be developed. So, together with Hippocrates, Galen was one of the greatest physicians of his time, and he took different advances about the anatomic knowledge of the brain, and he may be coined as the first experimental physiologist, which identified many of the major brain structure and described the behavioral changes that was related to different brain traumas. So, Galen also described that all physical functions included in the brain, as well as the rest of the body, depends on the balance of the bodily fluids or humors, which he referred to air, water, fire, and earth. He identified different brain areas which were related to different behaviors and different emotions. This was a major step on the understanding of the brain and on the understanding about how the brain could be the underlying organ of emotion and behavior. However, other authors were very important on the development of this idea that the brain is the organ of the mind. So later, Albert Magnus described that behavior results from a combination of brain structures that includes the cortex, the midbrain, and the cerebellum. Andreas Vesalius found some Galen's anatomic mistakes and he corrected them. Particularly, he corrected those errors that were related to the role of the ventricles and their effect on behavior. Also, Descartes, as you know, it's a very well-known philosopher that split the mind and the brain into physical different identities. So, he split between mental processes and physical abilities, and he stated that the mind and the body are separate. However, they may interact with each other. He stated that the pineal gland was the means by the body and the spirit, the body and the mind would interact. This is known as the dualism of the Descartes. Later, Thomas Willis described that the blood circulation in the brain, and he theorized that all mental faculties reside in the corpus striatum, a structure that is very deep within the cerebral hemispheres. So, as you can see here, different contributions from different authors start to emphasize different features of the brain functioning and the relationship between the brain and the mind, or in their words, the brain and the soul. So, now let's just summarize the contents of today. So, neuropsychology studies the relationship between brain, mind, and behavior. The brain and antiquity was an object of studies between the Greeks. However, the brain was not the center of the mind, was not the center of the soul. And the cell doctrine was a notion that stems from 2000 years of different discoveries about the workings of the mind and the workings of the brain, and anatomic discoveries of the soul, which we called anatomic discoveries of the mind, were very important to establish the brain as the organ of the mind, or in their language, in their notions, the organs of the soul. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video description regarding today's theme to see the manuals and the books that I am recommending to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Nº2. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here in Mind Brain Talks, I discussed and describe different topics related to psychology and neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to know something more about it. All videos here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So, this is the second video related to the theme what is neuropsychology. As we saw in the previous video, there are lots of different perspectives that were developed through the centuries and were the fundamentals of the idea about how the brain may be the organ of the mind. In this video, we will expand the notion and we will see how it evolved from the center of the soul to be the center of the mind, the brain to be the center of the mind, and how it can be applied to different branches of neuropsychology. Of course, the scientific discipline of neuropsychology had evolved parallel with other scientific major branches, such as neurosciences, neurobiology, or even medicine. But now let's see how it evolved from earlier findings to the contemporary findings. So now let's look at the manuals that I recommend to you today. The first one is the Principles of Neuropsychology. The second one is the Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology. The third is the Neuropsychology Handbook. The fourth is the Clinical Neuropsychology, the second edition from Jennifer Guard and John Marshall. The fifth is the Neuropsychological Assessment from Lezac. And the sixth is the Clinical Neuropsychology, a practical guide to assessment and management for clinicians. So now let's continue the second part of the video dedicated to the history of neuropsychology. So Franz Gall stated that the brain consists of a number of separate organs, each one responsible for basic psychological traits such as courage and friendliness. Franz Gall stated that the brain would also be explored by its geography, which is the notion of the borders at the time when people were discovering and mapping new continents. So, Franz Gall applied the notion of geography to brain exploration. Gall's basic theory defined of localization of brain functions, which is called the science of phrenology, which is how the phrenology was born. Gall's basic theory of localization was called phrenology. A given brain area is enlarged, then the corresponding area of the skull will also be enlarged, which is the notion that the brain may have some specific geography. Gall's theory was based on this assumption. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were two major neuropsychologists that were very important to establish the idea of language and localization. These two major neuropsychologists are Broca and Wernicke. Let's look to their major contributions. So, before the 19th century, people knew little about the cortex and the brain. Scientific evidence supporting a localization position of different functions in the brain was not available till 1861. Paul Broca found that motor speech was specifically located in the posterior inferior region of the left frontal lobe. Broca was also the founder of French anthropology. This is quite a curious fact. Broca's landmark contribution was in the understanding of the origins of aphasia, which is a neuropsychological syndrome. In Paris, he was a professor of chirurgy, which contributed most to the advancing of the field of brain anatomy. Broca presented 2 clinical cases to support his proposal for the locus of speech. So, he stated that individuals who had extensive injuries involving different brain areas, such as left posterior frontal lobe, corresponding paralysis on the right side of motor speech deficits. Again, this is the idea of a contralateral organization of motor speech. But in other respects, they appear to be intelligent and normal. So Broca started to note that individuals who have motor speech deficits had intelligent or normal other mental functions, which is an evidence of differentiated brain functionings based on different localizations. A decade after Broca's discovery, Carl van Eyck, another neuropsychologist that was very important to understand the speech phenomena, found that the understanding of speech was located in the superior posterior aspects of the temporal lobe, so a different area, a different brain area from motor speech production. So, Van Eyck noted that no motor deficit accompanied a loss of speech or comprehension caused by a damage in this area. Only the ability to understand speech was disrupted, which means that motor production of speech may be localized in a different area from speech comprehension. So this was very important in the advancement of cortical localization. And this cortical deficit was called Wernicke aphasia, which is a loss of speech comprehension caused by damage in the area of superior posterior aspects of temporal lobe. Another patient that was very important on the understanding of cortical localization of brain functioning was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was an American railroad worker who survived a massive accident where a large iron rod was driven completely through his head. This iron rod destroyed much of his brain's left frontal lobe, and Phineas Gage had recovered from this accident. However, his family and his friends start to notice some modifications in his personality, which means that this could be related to destruction of specific brain area. Phineas Gage raised a number of issues and fostered a discussion in the 19th century about the brain localization of mental functions and fostered the debate between mind and brain interactions, which was very important on the development of neuropsychology as a scientific field. Freud was also very important in the field of neuropsychology because he criticized the notion of localizationists. There were some psychologists and some physicians that were critics of the cortical localization theory. Sigmund Freud criticizes Wernicke and Broca regarding localization of doctrine of aphasia. So, Freud stated that the Broca and Wernicke area centers are nodal points in a general and complicated network of neurons. He proposed that Broca's and Wernicke areas were not self-acting agencies and their significance was simply due to their anatomic localization. Distinction between the ability to recognize an object and inability to name it is called agnosia, which is also a term that was coined to Freud. So, Pierre-Marie challenged Broca's findings by examining the preserved brains of the patients Broca had used to support his hypothesis of localization. Hermann Munk, experimental lesions in the association cortex of a dog produced temporary mind blindness. The animal could see objects but failed to recognize their significance. And Joseph Babinski introduced the term anosognosia, which means no knowledge of the disease, introducing the phenomenon of an awareness on the understanding of diseases. So, individuals may have some brain impairment, but they are not aware of this impairment. So here we are seeing the fundamentals of a great debate that took place in the beginning of the 20th century, which was the discussion of localization theory against functional theory or functionalization theory. So on one hand we have localization theorists which state that brain functions are localized in specific areas in the brain, and the other theorist, the functional theorist, says that the brain functions, says that the mental functions are distributed through the entire brain. Now we have these two perspectives and we try to integrate them in a coherent manner to understand how individuals function and how individuals may have some lesions in different functions in different areas of the brain. So, this is also accompanied by the notion that neurons are the fundamental units of the nervous system. Heinrich Hartz emphasized a neuron theory, which is each nerve cell communicates with others through contiguity rather than continuity. He stated that the brain has neuronal unities and neurons are the cells of these unities. Also, he stated that there are some nerve fibers which are called the cell processes. One very important neuropsychologist in the 20th century was Luria. Luria developed a conceptual model of the brain functions where he defined three different major functional areas. He developed a conceptual model for understanding the organization of higher mental abilities or faculties and proposed that human behavior correlates with brain function. So, in his model, Luria developed three main conceptions about brain functioning. So, lower brainstem structures developed to maintain the tone and energy supply of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex posterior to central sulcus or the fissure of Rolando are implying on the sensory impressions of visual, auditory and tactile nature and are identified, perceived and organized for comprehension. And 3. The cerebral cortex anterior to or in front of the central sulcus are specialized on the production and monitoring of motor responses. So these were the main neuropsychologists that help neuropsychology to reach to its form today. So now let's look at different kinds of or different branches from neuropsychology. So we can find different sub-areas here. Experimental neuropsychology, clinical neuropsychology, cognitive neuropsychology, forensic neuropsychology, and educational neuropsychology. Don't worry, in the future I will produce some videos talking about each one of these subfields, okay? So, clinical neuropsychology is more focused on the assessment and rehabilitation on neurocognitive deficits caused by brain injury, brain diseases, or brain malfunctioning. Forensic neuropsychology is focused on the study on how brain behavior relationships may help to assess criminal issues, and schools neuropsychologist is focused on how to foster neurocognitive processes related to learning and related to the acquisition of school contents. So typically, clinical neuropsychologists or neuropsychologists use standardized tests to assess different connections between brain functioning and behavioral actions. So, standardized tests are used to link cognitive and behavioral performance to specific neurocognitive processes. And neuropsychologists use individualized neuropsychology assessment to explore deficits and inform diagnosis. Standardization is known as the normative data, which allows comparisons between individuals who have brain deficits with individuals who do not have brain deficits. So this is some types of scales that neuropsychologists tend to use, such as Vector Memory Scale, Wisconsin Card Sorting Test, or the Bentham Visual Retention Test. So also there are other methods that neuropsychologists use to explore the activity of brain functioning, which are functional magnetic resonance, magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, or computed axial tomography. Also, there are other projects that may foster neuropsychology as a field, which are animal brain models and artificial intelligence, or the use of electrophysiology such as electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. And neuropsychologists also use experimental tasks to measure reaction times and accuracy to export performance in these same tasks. So, what is important to know is that neuropsychology has lots of major what is important to know is that neuropsychology is a scientific field that studies the relationship between brain behavior and cognition, and starts to understand how the brain functioning impacts on neurocognitive processes and how neurocognitive processes impact on overt behavior. So this is a very important notion to have about the scientific purpose of neuropsychology. And now let's just summarize the contents of today. So, in the beginning of the century, there was a great debate between localization and cerebral function, which was very important to the development of new ideas and new concepts and new empirical findings regarding the connection between cognition, brain and behavior. Broca and Wernicke were very important on the idea of the localization of the motor speech production and speech comprehension. Development was very important to understand about how the brain works within the speech phenomenon. Also, and actually, neuropsychology has different sub-areas and has different methods of research. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see this video's description regarding today's theme to see the manuals and the books that I used to develop a video like this. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, which is very important to support my channel. Also, you can give a comment to express your mind and to express your thoughts and to say something about the themes that you've heard here today. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neurosciences, neuropsychology, psychotherapy and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. In Mind Brain Talks, I discuss and describe topics from psychology to neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to know more about it. All contents here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So, now let's look to the manuals that I recommend to you today. The first one is The Principles of Neurosciences from Eric Kandel. The second one is Neuroscience, Explore the Brain from Beer Corners and Paradiso. And the third is Neuroscience, a 6th edition from Purvis and Agustin. The fourth is Fundamental of Neurosciences for basic and clinical applications. The fifth is the 9th edition of Biopsychology, which is a very good manual. And the sixth from Michael Gazigna, the Cognitive Neurosciences, which is the 5th edition. So, this video is focused on neurosciences. Here I'll give to you a definition and I will describe some brief moments in history that help to shape the modern neurosciences. Also, I will describe to you the major branches of neurosciences and we can see how it is focused on specific research subjects, okay? So, let's go! And now let's see the definition of neurosciences. Neuroscience or neural science is the scientific field that studies the nervous system and how the nervous system works and how it is structured and how it evolved and developed through time. Neuroscience is an interdisciplinary science that shares commonalities with other scientific disciplines such as biology, chemistry, psychology, computer sciences, and medicine. Neuroscience not only seeks to understand how the nervous system functions in the healthy conditions, but also it studies how the nervous system functions in neurodevelopmental, neurodegenerative, and psychiatric disorders. Neuroscientists may explore the relationships between brain, mind, and behavior from molecular level to complex overt behavior. Neuroscientists can specialize themselves in a wide range of fields, from neurobiology, neuroanatomy, neuropsychopharmacology to neuropsychology, which means that neurosciences it's a very wide field where different professionals can specialize themselves in different branches, but we will look to this in the future. So, neuroscience research methods may include fMRI, MEG, EEG or TMS, and neuroscience research methods may also include experimental tasks, neuropsychological batteries, or single-cell recordings. Don't worry, in the future I will produce some different videos focused on these specific research methods, okay? So now let's look to the main goals of neurosciences according to the Society of Neurosciences. The first goal is to understand the human brain and how it functions. The second goal is to understand and describe how the central nervous system develops, matures, and maintains itself. And the third, one main goal is to analyze and understand neurological and psychiatric disorders and discover methods to prevent or to heal them. Now let's look to a brief history of neurosciences. So, as you saw from the previous videos, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, had a theory that the brain was blood cooling mechanism. Now we will jump to a more contemporary approach where Paul Broca worked with patients who had brain damage and concluded that different regions in the brain were involved in specific functions. Broca's area is responsible for speech production, and damage to this area during a stroke can lead to Broca's aphasia, which is the inability to produce accurate or coherent speech. Helmholtz in the 19th century measured the speed of which nerve cells produced electric impulses. So, as you can see, some parts of the history of neurosciences were covered in the previous video. So, you can look to that video and you can see in detail what happened during the story of neuropsychology of neurosciences. Camillo Golgi, an Italian physician and pathologist, used silver chromate salt to see what neurons look like. In the beginning of the 20th century, Santiago Ramón y Cajal, Spanish histologist and neuroscientist, hypothesized that neurons are independent nerve cell units. Also, in the beginning of the 20th century, Golgi and Cajal jointly received the Nobel Prize in Physiology for their work and categorizations of neurons in the brain. Since 1950s, research and practice in neurosciences fuel advances in our understanding of the brain, nervous system, and general neurosciences. So, as you can see here, there are lots of pieces that were missing from this video regarding the history of neurosciences. So, in the future I will produce a more lengthy video with the more in-depth information where you can see how specific events in time and how specific contributions were the essentials to the understanding of how neural networks work and how the brain produces cognition and behavior. So now let's look to the major branches in neurosciences. Behavioral neuroscience focuses on the neurobiological basis of behavior to study how the brain relates to specific behaviors. Molecular and cellular neurosciences studies the form, the physiological and molecular properties of neurons and how they make up the brain and the nervous system as we know. Affective neurosciences is the exploration on how neurons and complex neural networks behave in relationship to emotions and affective processing. Cognitive neurosciences is focused on the study of the neural basis of cognition. It draws from psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, and philosophy. Clinical neuroscience is the study of disorders of the nervous system. And computational neuroscience is the application of advanced computer simulations to study how the brain computes information. Social neuroscience studies how neurobiological systems relate to behavior and social interactions. Developmental neurosciences studies the development of the nervous system at the cellular level. And neuroimaging, which is a medical imaging that concentrates on the brain. So, research in neurosciences inform different clinical approaches. When we look to medicine, we can see that neurosciences inform neurology, psychiatry, neurosurgery, neuropathology, and so forth. In psychology, research in neurosciences informs clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, and clinical neuropsychologists. So, research in neurosciences may also inform physiotherapy, such as rehabilitation methods and different techniques. So, this is not an extensive approach, okay? There are lots of clinical approaches that neurosciences inform that were not listed here. So, this is not an extensive list, okay? So, take this in mind. So, now let's just summarize the contents of this video. So, we look to the definition of neurosciences, which mainly is the study of nervous system. We look to the history of neurosciences and we look how it develops in research methodologies. Also, we look to the major branches of neurosciences, which is behavioral, clinical, cognitive, molecular neurosciences. So, as you can see, this is just a short video to explain to you the fundamentals of neurosciences from definition to its major branches. So in the future I will produce more videos that will describe with more depth these domains of this scientific field, okay? So it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video's description regarding today's theme, to look to the manuals that I recommend to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here, in Mind Brain Talks, I discuss and describe different topics from psychology to neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to learn more about it. All contents here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So, today's video is focused on neurodevelopmental and neurocognitive disorders according to the DSM-5. So, if you're curious about how the DSM-5 rearranged these two categories, this is a video right for you. This is just a brief descriptive video, therefore I will not detail specific criteria for each disorder, okay? But in the future I will make some different videos where I will look specific to diagnostic criteria of each disorder, okay? So now let's see how the DSM-5 rearranged these two clusters of neurodevelopmental and neurocognitive disorders. According to the DSM-5, neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions with onset in the developmental period. The disorders typically manifest early in development, often before the child enters the grade school, and are characterized by developmental deficits that produce impairments on personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. The range of developmental deficits varies from very specific limitations of learning or control of executive functions to global impairments of social skills or intelligence. So, the first category is intellectual disabilities, which encompass intellectual disability, global developmental delay, and unspecified intellectual disability. We have communication disorders, language disorder, speech sound disorder, childhood onset fluency disorder, social communication disorder, and unspecified communication disorder. Another category is autism spectrum disorder, which is a new category. In DSM-5, the category of Asperger disorder was mixed with autism disorder, and then this category was developed, which is the autism spectrum disorders. And individuals may be diagnosed from mild to severe autism spectrum disorder. But I will describe this in the future videos, okay? So another category is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, which encompass attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, which is the most common, other specified attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and unspecified attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Here we may also specify that there is a predomination in attention deficit or in hyperactivity, but we will see this in the future. So another two categories are specific learning disorder and motor disorders. And in specific learning disorders we have language disorder, mathematics, and in motor disorders we have developmental coordination disorder and stereotypic movement disorder. We also have tic disorders, which encompass Tourette's disorder, persistent motor or vocal tic disorder, provisional tic disorder, other specific tic disorder, and unspecified tic disorder. We also have other developmental disorders, which are other specified neurodevelopmental disorder and unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder. In many diagnostic criteria, here in DSM-5, you may specify the intensity or the severity of each disorder. So, typically we can describe each disorder from mild, moderate, severe, or profound. But in the future, we will take a deep look on these specific criteria, okay? So now let's see the neurocognitive disorders according to DSM-5. So, according to DSM-5, neurocognitive disorders, previously known as dementia, begin with delirium, followed by the syndromes of major neurocognitive disorders and mild cognitive disorders. The neurocognitive disorders that were previously referred as dementia, here in DSM-5 begin with delirium, followed by other syndromes. The neurocognitive category encompasses the group of disorders in which the primary clinical deficit is in cognitive function and that are acquired rather than developmental. So individuals acquire this type of disorders. Although cognitive deficits are present in many, if not all, mental disorders, however, only disorders whose core features are cognitive are included in the neurocognitive category. So, the neurocognitive disorders are those in which impaired cognition has not been present since birth or very early life, and thus represents a decline from a previously attained level of functioning. So, individuals acquire this type of disorders and then they start to have impairments in global functioning. The first is delirium, which may be substance intoxication or withdrawal delirium, medication-induced delirium, delirium due to another medical condition, delirium due to multiple etiologies, other specified delirium, and unspecified delirium. So, now let's look to the major and mild neurocognitive disorders. The first is Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal disease, Lewy body disease, vascular disease, traumatic brain injury, substance or medication use, AIDS infection, prion disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington disease, another medical condition, and multiple etiologies or unspecified disease. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video description regarding today's theme to see the manual that I recommend to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Welcome to mindbraintalks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone, welcome to mindbraintalks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here I discuss and describe topics from psychology to neurosciences, and I try to explain it the best as I can for you to understand and for you to learn something more about it. All research here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So today I'll talk about interpersonal neurobiology. We will take a brief look on the major aspects of this framework, and we will see how it gathers specifically aspects from the mind, the brain and relationships. But first, let's see the manuals that I recommend to you today. So the first manual is The Developing Mind from Daniel Siegel. The second manual is Neurosciences for Clinicians from Luis Cozzolino. And the third is Interpersonal Neurobiology and Clinical Practice, also from Daniel Siegel. And now, let's see what is interpersonal neurobiology. Interpersonal neurobiology is an integrative or interdisciplinary framework focused on human development and functioning. It was developed by Daniel Siegel, which is a psychiatrist in the 90s. So, it gathers different scientific disciplines such as neurosciences, psychology or anthropology to describe interactions between mind, brain and relationships. According to interpersonal neurobiology framework, the mind is viewed as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information through neuronal systems. These complex neuronal systems within interpersonal experiences can reshape genetically programmed maturation of the nervous system. And early interpersonal experiences may have an impact on brain development, and this may be the core of attachment disorders. So Daniel Siegel describes a model where we can find the simplified interactions between different brain structures to describe mind-brain relationships. The first brain structure is the brainstem, which is responsible for body regulation, such as heartbeat, stomach secretions, and autonomous nervous system. Hippocampus, which is responsible for explicit and declarative memory. Amygdala, which is responsible for containing implicit memories and fear emotional responses. And the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher function human abilities, such as complex thinking, decision making, or even emotion regulation. So, complex neural networks are integrated in the prefrontal cortex, and it controls 9 essential neurobiological and interpersonal functionings. So, body regulation, communication attunement, affective regulation, response flexibility, fear responses or fear modulation, the expression of empathy and the ability of insight, and also the ability of awareness or self-awareness and intuition. So, these 9 essential neurobiological functions are regulated by complex neural networks which are integrated in the prefrontal cortex. So, this is the basis for the interpersonal neurobiology framework. Also, according to interpersonal neurobiology framework, the mind has 4 major facets. Subjective experience, which relates to one's experience of subjective feelings and perceptions. consciousness, which is being aware of the self and being aware of the others, different cognitions, emotions, intentions, and needs. Information processing, which is also related to sequential and parallel processing of different information from human spheres, such as thoughts, emotions, behavior, or motivations. And self-organization, which is related to the structure of different parts of the mind. So, according to interpersonal neurobiology framework, the mind has these major four areas: subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, and self-organization. And now, let's look how interpersonal neurobiology looks to attachment and interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal neurobiology is focused on how relations and attachment relates to mind or brain functioning. So, there is a bidirectional interchange between heritability and environment. Neural networks, which encode dysfunctional experiences, may develop thicker axons and more dendrites. And these systems, when stimulated, these networks have more likely to fire and affect behavior, because these systems may be related to a survival mechanism. So, dysfunctional experiences are encoded in neural systems between the amygdala and the brainstem, which are strengthened by repetition or biases. And human experiences shapes neural systems that influences how the mind will develop. So, these experiences has impacts in neural systems, which produce some alterations in memory, emotion, awareness, flexibility, or even self-regulation. So, according to this framework, there are 9 domains of integration that are strictly associated with mental health. So, these 9 domains are consciousness, bilateral brain integration, brain connections from the brainstem to prefrontal cortex, integration of different aspects of the memory, also integrated different aspects of the narratives, which is the way how we make sense, how we make meanings from our inside worlds, integration of states of mind, integration of interpersonal communication with the others, integration of aspects of the passage of time within our lives and within our brains, and integration of identity, which means our sense of agency and belonging. So, according to interpersonal neurobiology framework, it is essential that we can integrate these 9 domains to engage in a healthier way of life and have a better mental health. So now let's just summarize the contents of today. So, interpersonal neurobiology may be viewed as an interdisciplinary framework and is focused on the brain-mind relationships. Also, it has a great emphasis in relationships and attachment, and has 9 domains of integration that are related with mental health. So, this is just an introductory video to show you what is interpersonal neurobiology. So, don't worry, in the future we have lots of time to engage in deeper explanations, okay? Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video description regarding to this theme in order to see the manuals and the books that I recommend to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. You can use the comment section below to express your thoughts and to express your mind. Let me know what you think about all of this. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!